was never further developed. At the beginning of development, the devs were controlling Mario with a keyboard, and only after 6 months were they able to use controllers. This is because the game was being developed as the Nintendo 64 was being created alongside it. Giles Goddard has said that they used modified Sega controllers for a while, and went through at least 100 prototypes before they settled on an official design for the Nintendo 64 controller. A lot of the prototypes focused on getting the central stick to feel right and pleasant to use. Goddard further said that the very first time Miyamoto tested out the Nintendo 64 was while playing Super Mario 64, since that game was perfect to see how the central stick feels. A lot of thought went into how the camera would move while operating the yellow buttons, but Goddard commented that he thinks Miyamoto didn't like them very much. I remember talking to him a couple of years ago. He said it would have been better to have 2 D-pads. It would have been a better balance to have the same on the left and the right. Since so much time was spent on Mario's movement and the camera, the courses were implemented much later in the game's development. The first course that made it into Super Mario 64 was Bob-omb's Battlefield, and it took about 6 months to develop. Although half a year was spent on Bob-omb's Battlefield, many other levels were reportedly almost 64 was Bob-omb's Battlefield, and it took about 6 months to develop. Although half a year was spent on Bob-omb's Battlefield, many other levels were reportedly almost thrown together. The level designers only made a few concept sketches and notes for the courses before they would directly design them on the computer hardware. There would only be some concept art sketches.
Кто-нибудь может, да, сработать? Пианист, понимаешь, пианист и концертмейстер, да. Вот в этом и риск, понимаешь, да? Ну да, ладно.
Wishes and brief notes or memos. For example, I talked with course director Yoshi Yamada about an idea for a level, then he'd make some quick sketches of it. Then we'd look over those and talk more, and those key elements of the level would be written down. Yamada and the other level designers then would refer back to those notes, while designing the levels with our software development tools. The same principle applied to the many characters in the game, such as enemies and bosses. Once the character models were designed, they went to our software, and the other level designers then would refer back to those notes, while designing the levels with our software development tools. The same principle applied to the many, such as enemies and bosses. Once the character models were designed, they went straight into the game, and were barely tweaked afterwards. The reason why everything was being added to the game so quickly was mostly because of the tight deadline the developers were facing. Super Mario 64 was Nintendo's most important launch title for the Nintendo 64, so it was absolutely crucial for the game to be ready on day one of the console's release. Although the Nintendo 64 was lacking in speed compared to the first PlayStation, for example, the console made up for it in the quality of the pixels, according to Goddard. Not a lot of people got that. For every pixel it drew, it put a lot of time and effort into it. They were nice pixels, nicely textured, nicely colored, nicely lit, nicely anti-aliased. The PlayStation put a lot of time gathered. Not a lot of people got that. For every big launch title for the Nintendo 64, so it was absolutely crucial for the game to be ready on day one of the console's release. Although the Nintendo 64 was lacking in speed compared to the first PlayStation, for example, the console made up for it in the quality of the pixels according to Goddard. Not a lot of people got that. For every pixel it drew, it put a lot of time and effort into it. They were nice pixels, nicely textured, nicely colored, nicely lit, nicely aliased. The PlayStation, speed-wise it was much faster, but the pixels were dreadful. There was no texturing, anti-aliasing. Blindingly fast, but the pixels just looked crap. Miyamoto made sure to put those quality pixels to good use, and his design philosophy for Mario 64 was to include as much detail as possible to display all the emotions of the characters. One of Miyamoto's goals was to portray the game's style as a 3D interactive cartoon. Additionally, the developers also took inspiration from their personal lives, and an interesting example of this is based on a story from assistant director Takashi Tezuka. The boos are apparently inspired by his wife. In an interview from 1995, Miyamoto explained that Tezuka's wife is normally very quiet and friendly, but got frustrated one day because Tezuka was spending too much time working on Mario 64. This sparked an idea in Tezuka for creating the boos. His idea was to shrink the boos when Mario is looking at them, but once Mario turns his back, the boos grow larger and start to follow Mario to attack him. When asked in the interview if his wife knows about this, Tezuka laughed and said that she does. While Yoshi can be found in the game, he was originally going to have a bigger role, and there were ideas for Mario being able to ride on Yoshi's back, as was possible in previous games. Unfortunately, the developers weren't able to find a satisfying way to incorporate Yoshi in time for the game's release. They didn't want to waste the model they created of the castle as an Easter egg. Mario's brother Luigi was also set to make an appearance in a split-screen co-op mode that never made it into the game. The co-op mode, along with Luigi, were cut from the game because the developers couldn't find a way to make the mode fun to play, as well as for the fact that the Nintendo 64 was only bundled with one controller. The game's music was composed by Koji Kondo, who not only made new interpretations of melodies from previous games, but also made completely new soundtracks. Kondo was very meticulous about the music and spent a lot of time on trying to make a soundtrack that would change depending on where the player was and what the player was doing. Mario's first outing on the Nintendo 64 was also one of the first times that voice actor Charles Martinet lent his voice to the plumber. Princess Peach was voiced by Leslie Swan, then senior editor of Nintendo Power, who was also responsible for writing all the English text in the game. Between November 22nd and November 24th in 1995, Nintendo held its then annual trade show called Nintendo Space World, where the Nintendo 64 made its first public appearance, and back then the console's name was revealed as the Ultra 64. To further highlight its reveal, Nintendo also provided a playable build of Super Mario 64 on the show floor, where anybody was able to test out the game. On day one of the public event, Nintendo also filed a patent for the Ultra 64, and it included 6 black and white images of the castle and its surrounding area. During the time of the event, the game was reportedly 50% finished, and featured basic controls for Mario. Furthermore, no less than 32 courses were implemented, which is more than double the courses that made it into the final game, if you exclude secret stages. However, only 2% of mapping for the stages was completed at that time, and Miyamoto had to regrettably cut a lot of the courses later on in development, since all of them 64 cartridge completed at that time. However, only 2% of mapping for the stages was completed at that time, and Miyamoto had to regrettably cut a lot of the courses later on in development, since all of them couldn't fit on the Nintendo 64 cartridge. Between Mario 64's first public showcase and the final release, a lot more time was spent on tweaking the controls, since the developers heard that a lot of people that tried out the playable build had some complaints, describing Mario's movements as wobbly, slippery, or less responsive to the button inputs. Super Mario 64, along with the Nintendo 64 console, was originally scheduled to release during the holiday season of 1995. However, in May of 1995, the release of the console was delayed until April 1996. Sometime later, the Nintendo 64 was delayed yet again, and one of the major reasons this time was because Miyamoto wasn't satisfied with Mario 64's progress and wanted more time to perfect the game. Former president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was happy to give the developers more time to finish Mario 64 and agreed to delay the game and the release of the console to June 1996. Game creators can finish games quickly if they compromise. Users have sharp eyes. They soon know if the games are compromised. Shigeru Miyamoto asked for 2 more months, and I gave them to him unconditionally. On June 23, 1996, Super Mario 64 was finally released in Japan, and a couple of months later, the game was released in North America on September 29, 1996. European countries had to wait until March 1, 1997, before they could enjoy Mario's first outing in 3D, almost a whole year after it was released in Japan. Super Mario 64 received universal acclaim from critics and gamers around the world, and quickly became the new standard for 3D platformers. The game's success also drove many sales of the Nintendo 64, and was a huge contributor to the console's initial popularity. Although Super Mario 64 wasn't the first 3D platformer, that credit goes to the PlayStation 1 launch game Jumping Flash, it was the first 3D platformer ever with a camera system that can be controlled independently from the player character. On May 5th, 2011, Super Mario 64's impact on the game industry was further solidified when it was chosen to be one of the 80 games to be displayed at the Smithsonian American Art Museum as part of the Art of Video Games exhibit that opened its doors on March 16, 2012. To this day, Mario 64 is still considered one of the best 3D platformers around. In 2013, for example, a couple of developers from Rare, a development studio that worked closely with Nintendo in the 90s, stated that during the development of their game Conker's Bad Fur Day in 2001, they drew a lot of inspiration from the gameplay and camera mechanics found in Mario 64. We were just copying Mario, weren't we? Which, to this day, is still the best 3D camera.
Наоборот, ну нет, наоборот, не надо. Это место не. Месяца 3, да, это я себе так говорю, да. Да, не хватит на себя, да, работать, ну, говорю. Ну, мне было в то время. Придется хоть настроиться, да. Плохо выглядишь просто. Да, да. Ну там тебя проседает эти движения. Наоборот, вот нет. Наоборот, нет, понял, наоборот. Наоборот, наоборот. Да, наоборот. Наоборот. Ну, как это есть там самый месяца 3 аккордеонка. Как это месяца 3? Как это 3 месяца можно приехать на работу? Ну, 3 месяца так нет, вот я понял. Ну нет, понял. Ну она имеет в виду, что работать. Да наоборот. Нет, наоборот, вот нет, наоборот. Ну вот это он имеет в виду. Да наоборот. Ну нет, ну нет. Кое-как пьешь их. Ну это он не. Да наоборот, ты издеваешься что ли? Зачем так писать-то? Тебе говорю. О себе так думать просто что-то. Ну вот надо, вот это серьезно так думаешь, да, понял, да. Наоборот, нет, наоборот, ты подумал, да. Наоборот, ну вот наоборот, да. Нет, ну наоборот, вот нет. Ну вот это есть, на себя, ну нет, ну он даже не понял, вот это есть на самом деле. Он не шутит, что ли? себе так, он просто думает, да. Так нет. Да ну тебя, нет, вот надо, Hello there. Вот нет, наоборот.
Hey video creators, with Envato Elements you can create better videos. How? With unlimited downloads.
You kill a lot of random monsters, sometimes even humans, in every RPG, and the consequences for this are never addressed. What if they were? This is a question that sparked the idea for the indie game Undertale, an RPG made by Toby Fox, who did all the writing, programming, music, and some of the art for the game. The rest of the artwork is done by one of his friends Tammy Chang, and a few other artists that are credited on the Kickstarter campaign for Undertale. Toby deliberately wanted to keep the team as small as possible, as he believes the bigger a development team gets, the more diluted the game becomes. Toby deliberately wanted to keep the team as small as possible, as he believes the bigger a development team gets, the more diluted the game becomes. One of Undertale's biggest influences goes back to when Toby was only 4 years old, which is when he started playing Earthbound on the Super Nintendo, and this early gaming experience had a lasting impression on him. I was so young that it helped me learn to read, and also transformed my brain forever. 7 years later, Toby discovered the Earthbound fan site Starman.net, and now he finally had a place to talk and connect with other Earthbound fans. A few of his friends from the fan site now run the Fangamer website, which sells Toby's Undertale merchandise. In the year 2000, Toby and his 3 brothers started playing around with the RPG Maker 2000 tool to make role-playing games. He said they barely finished any of them, and none of them were ever released on the internet. When he was in high school, Toby created quite a few Earthbound ROM hacks as well, and the most notable one is the Halloween hack that he released in 2008 on the Starman website. Besides keeping his love for Earthbound alive during high school, Toby also started playing the piano and trumpet, which in turn sparked his love for composing music. Fast forward to his time in college, where Toby started putting together the building blocks for his first real video game project. He initially didn't start with a concrete idea for either the story or gameplay, and the first piece of inspiration actually came from Wikipedia. One day, I randomly read about arrays, and realized I could program a text system using them. So, I decided to make a battle system using that text system, which in turn gave them. I randomly read about arrays, and realized I could program a text system using them. So, I decided to make a battle system using that text system, which in turn gave me many ideas for a game. Then, I decided to make a demo of that game, to see if people liked it, and if it was humanly possible to create. This combat system was also further inspired by Shin Megami Tensei, where the player can talk to demon enemies in order to recruit them. It always interested me that you could talk to monsters to avoid conflicts, but the conversations were often kind of repetitive, and if you screwed them up, fighting became your only option. I wanted to create a system that satisfied my urge for talking to monsters. Toby felt that it was important to make every monster feel like an individual. He further said that basically all monsters in RPGs like Final Fantasy are the same, besides the actual designs of the enemies. They attack you, you heal, you attack them, they die. There's no meaning to that. Toby's experimental text-based combat system was made in GameMaker 8, and the developer would use an upgraded version of this engine called GameMaker Studio, and later GameMaker Studio 2, for the rest of Undertale's development. However, Toby also used GameMaker 8 to create a demo for Undertale. As for Undertale's core concept, Toby wanted to make an RPG, but he wanted it to be different from all the games he grew up with. I wanted to make an RPG game but be different from all the games he grew up with, where you could befriend all of the bosses, where not killing everything is actually a viable option. If you think about it, most RPGs are endless murder fests. How many monsters do you kill, and to what end? Everything sort of naturally arose from that concept. Now that he had settled on an engine and had a core concept for the game, it was time to start sketching characters and craft a story. During this part of the development process, his love for the Earthbound series definitely had an influence on some of the characters and the writing. I can definitely say that I wanted to make something that had as much emotional power, humor, and wonder as the Mother games, while not necessarily taking the same paths to achieve it. Also, the main character is a kid wearing a striped shirt. That's probably too obvious. Although Toby looked to the Mother series as a main source of inspiration, Undertale ended up becoming something that had as much emotional power, humor, and wonder as the Mother games, while not necessarily taking the same paths to purpose. His love for the Earthbound series definitely had an influence on some of the characters and the writing. I can definitely say that I wanted to make something that had as much emotional power, humor, and wonder as the Mother games, while not necessarily taking the same paths to achieve it. Also, the main character is a kid wearing a striped shirt. That's probably too obvious. Although Toby looked to the Mother series as a main source of inspiration, Undertale ended up becoming something very different compared to most RPGs, and that was no accident. Toby wanted to challenge conventional RPG mechanics and tropes, and fully embrace the video game medium. He said he's very tired of traditional JRPGs, and wanted to see one that's not boring to play, one that has interesting characters, and utilizes the medium as a storytelling device as much as possible, instead of having the story and gameplay abstractions be completely separate. An example of this is the character Toriel, who serves as a sort of guide for the player during the first moments of the game. Toby deliberately depicted Toriel as an overprotective mother, to poke fun at the Toriel levels found in many modern games. However, Toby also gave Toriel a more important role, since he feels that mother characters in games have seen a decline. There really aren't enough mother characters in RPG games. In Pokemon, Mother, Mother 2, there's this trope of having mothers be there only to say goodbye to their 10-year-old kid as they go out into the world. They're basically just symbols rather than characters. Even Mother 3's mother character, Inawa, doesn't really show up very much in the scheme of things. So here is Toriel, a mom that hopefully acts like a mom. She won't let you explore a dangerous world by yourself because she genuinely cares about your well-being. As previously mentioned, most of the art was done by Toby and Tammy Chan. While Toby had final say over all the artwork, Tammy is credited as the logo designer, cutscene artist, overworld artist, animator, shop artist, and tile artist.
Что тебе не нравится?
Х.